A single mother sat crying outside Boston Children's Hospital with a surgery bill she couldn't pay. The billionaire walking out the front door saw her and stopped. It wasn't the tears. It wasn't the crumpled invoice in her fist. It wasn't the little girl beside her, signing words into the air that no one around them understood. It was the scarf. A wool scarf wrapped around the woman's neck, hand-knitted, frayed at the edges, 7 years old. Because that scarf used to be hers. And the last time Julian Vance saw it, she was draping it over his shoulders in a diner at 2 a.m. on the worst night of his life. Before we get into this story, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's continue. 45-year-old Julian Vance hadn't stepped into a diner past midnight in 7 years. Julian Vance was not the kind of billionaire who showed up on magazine covers holding a glass of whiskey and a philosophy about grinding. He didn't give TED Talks. He didn't post motivational quotes on LinkedIn. He didn't sit across from podcast hosts explaining how discipline and vision built his empire. He ran a $3.8 billion hedge fund from a glass-walled office on the 40th floor of a tower in the financial district of Boston. And if you passed him on the sidewalk in a crowd, you wouldn't stop. You wouldn't turn. You wouldn't know that the man in the Navy suit walking past the hot dog cart had more money in his checking account than most neighborhoods earned in a decade. That was intentional. At 45, Julian was the sole managing partner of Vance Capital Group, a quantitative hedge fund that traded in patterns most human beings couldn't see: algorithms, probabilities. The invisible architecture of global markets reduced to numbers on a screen that moved faster than thought. He'd built it from nothing. Not from a family legacy. Not from a Harvard MBA handed to him on a silver tray. Not from a father who opened the first door with a phone call and a last name that meant something. From a folding table in a rented room in Somerville, where he sat in 2019 with a borrowed laptop, a spreadsheet, and $11,400 in seed money, scraped together from every odd job he'd worked since he was 22. The laptop became a trading desk. The trading desk became an office. The office became a floor. The floor became a firm. And the man who once heated his apartment with the oven door open because the gas bill was past due became the man in the penthouse on Beacon Hill, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Charles River and a kitchen that had never been used. Not once. Not a single burner lit. Not a single pan touched. The refrigerator held bottled water and nothing else. The penthouse was 3,200 square feet of silence, arranged to look like success. Italian marble countertops. A leather couch that cost $14,000. Bookshelves lined with first editions he'd never read, bought by an interior designer who charged $200 an hour to make Emptiness look elegant. There were no photographs on the walls, no birthday cards on the mantel, no coat draped over a chair by someone who'd just come home. Julian's penthouse was a museum, beautiful, cold, and completely empty of anything that mattered. His watch cost $42,000. A Patek Philippe Nautilus, steel case, blue-black dial, the kind of timepiece that didn't announce wealth so much as assume it. He wore it every day, not because he loved watches, because it was the first thing he bought the day his fund crossed $1 billion in assets under management, and every time he looked at it, he remembered what time used to mean when you had nothing. Time meant counting hours until the next paycheck. Time meant how long you could stretch a jar of peanut butter. Time meant sitting in a cold apartment, watching the minutes pass, and wondering if they were the last ones worth counting. Julian didn't throw parties. He didn't date. His driver, a quiet man named Gerald who'd worked for him for 9 years, drove him in a black Bentley Continental with tinted windows, but Julian sat in the back seat the way a man sits in a hospital waiting room. Still, distant, watching the city scroll past the glass like a movie he'd already seen the ending of. Because the truth about Julian Vance, the truth that no Bloomberg profile or Forbes feature or Wall Street Journal sidebar had ever touched, was that he hadn't felt anything real in 7 years. Not joy, not excitement, Not the rush that other people seem to get from money or power or the view from the top of the world. Every achievement arrived at his door like a package addressed to someone who'd already moved out. The fund hit $2 billion. Nothing. $3 billion. Nothing. A profile in Barron's called him one of the sharpest minds in quantitative finance. He read it on his phone in the back of the Bentley, closed the screen, and looked out the window at a woman waiting at a bus stop in the rain, and felt more connected to her than to anything the article had said about him. He had no family, no wife, no children, no relationship that had lasted longer than 6 months, because every woman who got close enough eventually asked the same question: "What are you afraid of?" And Julian could never answer. Not because he didn't know, because the answer was too simple to say out loud. He was afraid of owing someone something he didn't know how to repay. He was afraid of being given something kind and watching it rot in his hands because he'd forgotten how to hold things gently. He was afraid that the man who'd rebuilt himself from nothing had built the walls so high that no one could get in. And the loneliest part was that the walls had worked. He'd built a fortune designed to make sure he never needed anyone again. The problem was, it worked. 7 years ago, Julian Vance had needed someone. He just didn't know it until a 19-year-old waitress with a stained apron and a hand-knitted scarf decided he was worth saving. January 2019, Boston. The kind of cold that didn't just bite. It lived inside you, moved into your bones like a tenant who had no intention of leaving. The wind came off the Charles River at 15 miles per hour and turned every sidewalk into a corridor of ice and regret. Julian was 38. 6 months earlier, he'd been a rising fund manager with $140 million under management, a corner office at a mid-tier firm, and the kind of momentum that made people use words like trajectory and upside when they talked about him. Then his partner, a man named David Reeves, who Julian had trusted the way you trust a brother you chose instead of inherited, liquidated 3 client accounts without authorization, moved $6.2 million into an offshore shell company, and disappeared. The SEC froze everything. Julian's accounts, the firm's accounts. Every cent that had Julian's name attached to it was locked behind an investigation he had no part in but couldn't escape from. The clients sued. The firm collapsed. The lawyers took what was left. And Julian Vance, who had spent 16 years climbing out of poverty with his fingernails and his discipline and the quiet, relentless belief that if he just worked hard enough, the math would eventually work in his favor, found himself standing in the lobby of his apartment building, being told by the property manager that his rent check had bounced. He moved into a studio in Somerville, $650 a month, a radiator that clanked like a dying animal and produced heat the way a candle produces light, enough to know it's there, not enough to make a difference. He ate ramen, the 2 5-cent packs from the corner bodega. The ones with the seasoning packets that tasted like salt had a fight with MSG, and both lost. He wore his coat inside because turning up the heat meant choosing between warmth and eating, and he'd already made that choice once this week. He stopped answering his phone, not because people were calling, because they weren't. The silence of failure is louder than any sound poverty makes. No one checks on you when you fall. They just stop inviting you to the places where standing is required. He didn't shower for 4 days. He didn't open the blinds. He sat on the edge of a mattress on the floor and stared at a wall with a crack running from the ceiling to the light switch, and he traced that crack with his eyes over and over, like it was a map to somewhere that made sense. His phone died on the 2nd day. He didn't charge it. There was no one to call. There was no one who would answer. On the 5th night, the coldest night of January, 17 degrees Fahrenheit with a wind chill that made it feel like 4, Julian put on every layer he owned and walked out of his apartment at 1:45 inches the morning. Not because he had somewhere to go, because the apartment was so cold and so quiet that staying inside felt like agreeing to disappear. He walked 6 blocks down Massachusetts Avenue until he saw a light. A diner. The kind with the yellow sign and the counter stools, and the smell of coffee that had been sitting on a burner since 8 p.m. The kind of place that only exists for people who have nowhere else to be at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in January. He sat in a booth in the back corner. He didn't order. He didn't have money to order. He just sat with his hands on the table and his eyes on nothing, and waited for the cold to leave his body long enough for him to walk back home. The waitress noticed him after 4 minutes. Clara Murphy, 19 years old. Hair pulled back in a ponytail that had started the shift neat, and was now held together by stubbornness and a single elastic band. Apron splattered with something red, either marinara or ketchup. She'd stopped distinguishing between the two around hour 6. Sneakers worn down at the heel, the left sole starting to separate from the rubber. But she moved through the empty diner with a lightness that didn't match the hour, or the uniform, or the bags forming under her eyes. She came to his table with a bowl of chicken soup. Set it down in front of him without asking. Steam curled off the surface like a small warm ghost. Julian looked up at her. She looked back. Kitchen's about to close. This one didn't make it onto anyone's ticket. So it's either you or the trash. And honestly, you look like you could use it more. She said it with a smile. Not a server smile. Not the rehearsed, customer-facing expression that people in the service industry perfect by their second week. A real one. The kind that came from a 19-year-old girl, working a graveyard shift in a diner in January, who still, somehow, despite everything, believed that kindness was worth the effort, even when nobody was keeping score. Julian stared at the soup. Chicken broth, noodles, carrots cut into small, uneven circles, a few pieces of celery. Simple, plain, the kind of soup that costs a restaurant about 40 cents to make and means absolutely nothing to anyone who isn't starving. It was the first hot food Julian had touched in 3 days. He picked up the spoon. His hand was shaking. Not from the cold, from something deeper than cold, from the realization that a stranger had just done something for him that no one in his professional life, no partner, no client, no colleague, had thought to do in 5 months. She'd noticed. He ate slowly. He didn't speak. Clara refilled his water twice and didn't ask questions. That was the second act of kindness. Sometimes the most generous thing you can give a man who is falling apart is permission to fall apart in silence. When Julian stood to leave, his legs stiff from the cold, Clara was wiping down the counter near the door. She looked at him, reached up, and unwound the scarf from her own neck, hand-knitted. Gray-blue yarn, slightly uneven stitches, frayed at both ends. She'd made it herself. He could tell by the way the tension varied, tighter in some rows, looser in others, the fingerprint of someone who'd learned to knit from a YouTube video, and a patience that came from having nothing else to do on nights off. She draped it over his shoulders. Julian opened his mouth to protest. "You're not done yet. Eat the soup. Wear the scarf. Come back when you figure out what's next." 5 words. "You're not done yet," said by a 19-year-old girl in a diner apron who had no idea who he was, no idea what he'd lost, no idea that the man standing in front of her had spent 5 days deciding whether the world still had a place for him in it. She didn't know any of that. She just saw a man who looked cold and empty and alone, and she gave him the only 2 things she had. A bowl of soup that wasn't hers to give, and a scarf off her own neck in January. Julian walked out into the cold. The scarf smelled like diner grease and cheap laundry detergent. It was the warmest thing he'd felt in months. He never went back to that diner. He never learned her name. But 6 months later, when he sat down at a folding table in a rented room with a borrowed laptop and $11,400, the scarf was draped over the back of the chair behind him. That scarf cost Clara Murphy nothing. It saved Julian Vance everything. And he never knew where to send the thank you note, because you can't address a letter to a girl whose name you never asked. 7 years later, Clara Murphy was 26 years old and living a life that looked nothing like rescue. She lived in a studio apartment on Geneva Avenue in Dorchester, 420 square feet, $1,200 a month. That was 55% of her take-home pay, which meant every other expense in her life was being divided up from the remaining 45%, the way a mother divides a meal when there isn't enough, carefully, creatively, and always in someone else's favor. She worked 2 jobs: server at a breakfast restaurant in Brookline, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., cleaning crew at an office building in the financial district, 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. Between shifts, she picked up her daughter from the subsidized daycare on Bowden Street, fed her, bathed her, played with her in the narrow space between the bed and the kitchenette, and tried to fit an entire childhood into 3 hours, because 3 hours was all the math allowed. Her daughter's name was Lily, 5 years old, brown curls, hazel eyes that tracked the world with the quiet intensity of a child who had learned to read faces instead of sounds. Lily had been born with profound bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, both ears, complete. The doctors explained it with charts and diagrams and a vocabulary designed to make devastation sound clinical. Clara sat in the NICU at 21 years old, alone. The father already gone before the ink dried on the birth certificate, and listened to a specialist tell her that her daughter would likely never hear her voice. Clara went home that night to the apartment on Geneva Avenue, put Lily in the crib, sat on the kitchen floor, and cried until her chest hurt. Then she opened YouTube on her phone, typed how to learn sign language, and started watching. She taught herself ASL from free videos, every night after Lily fell asleep, 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. 2 hours of studying hand shapes and facial grammar, and the particular way you had to move your body to make a sentence mean what you intended it to mean. She practiced in the mirror. She practiced on the bus. She practiced while scrubbing toilets in the financial district, her hands signing words into the air between stalls while the soap dripped off her wrists. By the time Lily was 2, Clara could sign full conversations. By the time Lily was 3, Lily was signing back. The apartment on Geneva Avenue was the quietest home on the block and the most articulate. Every surface had a word attached to it. Magnets on the fridge with hand-shape illustrations. Flashcards taped to the bathroom mirror. A world built in silence that was somehow louder than anything on the other side of the walls. Clara's alarm went off at 4:50 every morning. She showered in 4 minutes, dressed in 3, made Lily's breakfast, always Lily's breakfast, never her own. Oatmeal with banana slices and a cup of milk. She packed Lily's bag for daycare. The same small purple backpack every day with a change of clothes, a snack, the hearing aids that didn't work well enough but cost too much to replace, and to a picture book. Because Clara believed that even a child who couldn't hear could still fall in love with stories if someone held her close enough to feel the words in their chest. She dropped Lily off at 5:45, 15 minutes before the daycare officially opened, because the morning manager, a woman named Darlene who had raised 4 kids of her own, came early just for them. Darlene never asked for extra money. She just unlocked the door, took Lily's hand, and said the same thing every morning in the sign language Clara had taught her. "Good morning, sunshine." Clara drove to Brookline in a Honda Civic, 2006. Faded silver. 167,000 miles. A dent in the rear bumper. The check engine light had been on for 14 months, and Clara had stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing a crack in the ceiling of an apartment you can't afford to fix. The car started every morning, and that was the only prayer she had time to say. She served tables until 2, smiled at customers who tipped well and customers who didn't, refilled coffees, carried plates, stood for 8 hours on feet that hadn't seen a new pair of shoes in a year, because shoes cost $60, and $60 was Lily's hearing aid batteries for 6 weeks. $8.50 per pack, replaced every 5 days, $51 a month. The cost of hearing, even partial hearing, even the inadequate, muffled, distorted approximation of hearing that Lily's outdated analog aids provided, was $51 a month. $51 a month for a child to hear fragments of a world that was fully available to everyone else for free. After the morning shift, Clara picked up Lily, brought her home, cooked dinner, rice and beans most nights. chicken thighs when they were on sale, spaghetti with sauce from a jar if it was the end of the week and the grocery budget had already been spent on the things that mattered more. Milk for Lily, vitamins for Lily, bananas for Lily, eggs for Lily. Nothing for Clara. No coffee, no shampoo. She'd been using the same bar of soap for her hair for 2 months. No hand lotion for the skin that cracked and bled every winter from the bleach and the ammonia and the cold. No new jacket, even though the zipper on hers had been broken since November and March and Boston came through denim like it wasn't there. Her neighbor across the hall, an older woman named Mrs. Tavares, who wore reading glasses on a chain and always smelled like lavender and Bengay, stopped Clara one evening in the hallway. "How's Lily doing? Must be hard, you know, her not being able to hear." Clara shifted Lily to her other hip, smiled, soft, practiced. "She hears me just fine." 5 words, the same way she said them every time. To the neighbor, to the pediatrician, to the daycare worker who asked if Lily needed special accommodations. "She hears me just fine." A sentence that was technically about Lily's hearing, but was actually about Clara's refusal to let the world see the truth. That Lily was growing up in silence. That the hearing aids amplified sound the way a flashlight illuminates a stadium, barely, unevenly, not enough. That there was a surgery, a cochlear implant, that could change everything, that could open a door in Lily's brain that had been sealed shut since birth, and it cost $48,200, and Clara's insurance didn't cover it, and Medicaid had denied the claim twice, and $48,200 was a number that existed in a language Clara had never been taught, the language of people who didn't have to choose between hearing and eating. "She hears me just fine" was not a statement. It was a wall, built 1 brick at a time by a mother who could not afford to let it crack, because behind it was a flood of grief she had no time, no energy, and no safety net to survive. Julian Vance arrived at Boston Children's Hospital on a Thursday evening in March for the kind of event he despised but attended, because obligation was the only social contract he still honored. A fundraising gala, black tie, crystal glasses filled with wine that cost more per bottle than Clara Murphy earned in a shift, a string quartet playing Vivaldi in the atrium while donors in $3,000 dresses and $5,000 suits wrote checks and shook hands and congratulated each other on caring about children they would never meet. Julian wore the Tom Ford, navy blue. The Patek Philippe was visible at the cuff. He moved through the room the way he moved through every room, present but not there, shaking hands without gripping, smiling without showing teeth, answering questions about the market with the precise, automated fluency of a man who had rehearsed being alive so many times the performance no longer required effort. He wrote a check, $250,000, handed it to the hospital director, a woman named Dr. Ananya Rao, who accepted it with the professional warmth of someone who understood that men like Julian Vance gave money the way other people took aspirin, not to cure anything, just to dull the ache long enough to get through the night. By 7:45, Julian needed air. The atrium was too bright. The wine was too sweet. The conversations were too hollow. He slipped through a side door that led to a covered walkway outside the main entrance, a strip of concrete with 2 benches and a view of the parking lot that no event planner had ever thought to decorate, and he heard it, crying, not loud, not theatrical. The kind of crying that happens through closed teeth and pressed lips, the kind that leaks instead of pours, the kind that only a person who has spent years suppressing their own pain can recognize because they know exactly what it sounds like when someone is trying to hold the ocean back with their hands. A woman sat on the far bench, late 20s, thin jacket, denim, the zipper broken halfway up, her hair pulled back tight, clean but dry. She was holding a piece of paper in both hands, her fingers gripping the edges the way you grip something you want to crumble but can't because the number on it is real and crumbling won't change the math. 48,200 美元. Julian could read the total from 10 feet away. It was printed in bold at the bottom of what looked like an itemized surgical estimate. Cochlear implant, bilateral, pediatric. The number sat on the page like a verdict. A little girl sat beside her. 5 years old, maybe. Brown curls spilling from under a pink knit hat. She wore a coat slightly too big. The sleeves rolled twice at the wrists. Small hearing aids visible behind both ears, the beige plastic kind that insurance sometimes covered and technology had long outgrown. The child was not crying. She was watching her mother with eyes that understood something no 5-year-old should have to understand. Her small hands moved, quick, precise, fingers forming shapes in the cold air. Sign language. She was signing to her mother. 2 words. Mama sad? Clara wiped her eyes with the heel of her palm. She didn't look at the invoice. She looked at Lily. Her hands moved back, slower, deliberate. The way you sign when you want the lie to look like truth. No, baby. Mama's fine. Mama's fine. She hears me just fine. The same architecture. The same scaffold of denial built by a woman who had decided long ago that the only way to protect her child from the weight of what was missing was to pretend it wasn't there. Julian stood 15 feet away. He saw the woman. He saw the child. He saw the invoice. And for a moment, he felt the familiar pull of distance, the instinct to look away, to return to the gala, to write another check and let the system do whatever the system was designed to do. But then the wind shifted, just slightly, and Julian saw the scarf, wrapped around the woman's neck, gray-blue wool, hand-knitted. The stitches uneven, tighter in some rows, looser in others, frayed at both ends. 7 years of wear pressed into every fiber. A scarf that had no business still existing. A scarf that should have fallen apart years ago, but it hadn't, because someone had taken care of it. Someone had washed it gently, dried it flat, repaired the edges when they frayed, and kept wearing it long after it stopped keeping out the cold because the scarf had never been about warmth. It had been about something she'd given away once to a stranger who needed it more. Julian's hand went to his own collar. Instinct. The phantom weight of wool that hadn't sat on his shoulders in 7 years, but that he still felt every winter night when the temperature dropped and the wind came off. The Charles in the city got quiet enough for memory to speak. He knew that scarf. He knew the uneven stitches. He knew the gray-blue yarn. He knew the way the fraying started at the left end first because the yarn was thinner there. He knew because he'd held it. He'd worn it. He'd draped it over the back of a folding chair in a rented room in Somerville, while he rebuilt his life from nothing on a borrowed laptop, and $11,400 and 5 words from a girl whose face he remembered but whose name he never learned. You're not done yet. The woman on the bench. The crying woman with the crumpled invoice and the 5-year-old who spoke with her hands. The woman in the broken zipper jacket who had just lied to her daughter with the same practiced grace that Julian recognized from a diner counter at 2 a.m. 7 years ago. It was her, the girl from the diner. The girl who gave him soup when he had nothing. The girl who unwound a scarf from her own neck in January because a stranger looked cold and she decided that mattered more than her own warmth. Julian Vance stood outside Boston Children's Hospital in a Tom Ford suit that cost $5,200 and a Patek Philippe that cost $42,000 and felt the entire scaffolding of the past 7 years collapse. Inside his chest so quietly that no one heard it. 7 years ago, she had everything he needed, and nothing the world would call valuable. A bowl of soup, a hand-knitted scarf, and 5 words that reached into the darkest corner of a man's life and turned on a light he didn't know was there. Now he had everything the world called valuable. $3.8 billion. A penthouse. A Bentley. A name that meant something in rooms full of people who measured human worth in basis points and quarterly returns. And she was sitting on a concrete bench outside a hospital, crying into an invoice she couldn't pay, lying to her daughter's hands because the truth cost $48,200. And the truth was that her little girl was growing up in silence, and the system had looked at the math and decided that hearing wasn't worth funding. 7 years ago, Clara Murphy gave Julian Vance everything she had. She asked for nothing, and the universe, in its brutal, patient arithmetic, had spent 7 years arranging the moment when he would find her again, not as a stranger, but as the answer to a debt he didn't know how to name. Julian didn't approach her. Not yet. He turned around, walked back through the side door, past the string quartet, past the crystal glasses, past the donors who were still congratulating each other on caring. He found an empty hallway near the radiology department. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The floor smelled like antiseptic. A monitor beeped somewhere behind a closed door, steady and mechanical, the sound of a machine keeping something alive. He pulled out his phone. His hands were steady. His voice was not. He dialed Marcus Porter, his chief of staff, 12 years. The only person in Julian's professional life who had ever seen him without the armor. Marcus answered on the first ring. "What do you need?" Julian leaned against the wall. The tile was cold against his shoulder blade through the Tom Ford. "I need a full profile. Not financial. Everything. Employment history, housing, family structure, medical, education. Everything you can pull in 36 hours. Who?" Julian closed his eyes. He saw the scarf. He saw the soup. He saw the hands of a 19-year-old girl unwinding wool from her own neck in the coldest month of the year. "I don't know her name, but I have a vehicle description. Faded silver Honda Civic, 2006, dent in the rear bumper. She was outside the hospital, parked in the east lot, and Marcus. This stays between us." He hung up. Marcus sent the file 36 hours later. 11:42 p.m. Julian opened it on his laptop in the penthouse. The Charles River was black and still through the windows behind him. The city hummed. His coffee had gone cold. He hadn't noticed. Clara Ann Murphy, 26 years old, born in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Mother, Eileen Murphy, registered nurse at a long-term care facility in Mattapan for 19 years. Died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. She was 51. No life insurance, no estate, no savings. Just a daughter and a granddaughter she helped raise between 12-hour nursing shifts and chemotherapy appointments. She started skipping because the copay was $35, and $35 was a week of groceries. Julian read that line twice. Eileen Murphy died at 51. His own mother had died when he was 12. Heart attack, kitchen floor. No warning, no goodbye. Just a woman who worked herself empty, and a boy who found her there when he came home from school. He kept reading. Clara's father, Patrick Murphy, left when Clara was 6. No forwarding address, no child support, no birthday cards, no phone calls. Just a man who decided the doorframe was a finish line and everything on the other side of it was someone else's race to run. Clara graduated from South Boston High School with a 3.6 gigapascals. Accepted into the hospitality management program at Bunker Hill Community College. Completed 3 semesters. Instructors described her as driven, organized, uncommonly mature. Then she got pregnant. She was 21. The father, a man named Tyler, whose last name appeared once in the file and then vanished entirely, promised things men promise when the promise costs them nothing, and the breaking of it costs them even less. He was gone before Lily was born. Clara withdrew from Bunker Hill, not because she chose to, because choosing requires options, and a 21-year-old single mother with no family, no partner, no savings, and no safety net does not have options. She has emergencies arranged in order of urgency, and education, no matter how much she wanted it, could not compete with rent and diapers, and the particular kind of terror that comes from holding a newborn in a studio apartment at 3 a.m. and realizing that every single thing this child will ever need has to come from you, and only you, and there is no second pair of hands coming through that door. She took 2 jobs, server in the morning, cleaning crew at night, the same schedule, the same split shift, the same 1 6-hour days that left her smelling like 2 different kinds of tired. Housing. Studio apartment, Geneva Avenue, Dorchester. 420 square feet, $1,200 per month. Income, approximately $2,180 per month, combined. That meant 55% of everything Clara earned went to keeping a roof over her daughter's head. The remaining 45% covered food, transportation, Lily's daycare, the hearing aid batteries at $8.50 per pack, replaced every 5 days. That was $51 per month, roughly the cost of 1 week of groceries, spent entirely on batteries for devices that amplified sound, the way a paper cup amplifies a whisper. Technically functioning, practically useless. Lily's hearing loss was classified as profound. The audiologist's notes in the file described it in clinical terms: greater than 90 decibels bilateral, consistent with congenital sensorineural etiology. The recommended intervention was cochlear implantation, bilateral. Estimated cost, $48,200. Insurance denied. Medicaid denied. Twice. Appeals pending. Processing time, 8 to 14 months. 8 to 14 months. A little girl growing up in silence, while a bureaucracy decided whether her ears were worth the paperwork. Julian closed the laptop. The screen went dark. The penthouse went quiet. He sat in the leather chair that cost more than Clara Murphy's annual rent and looked at the skyline he'd once been proud of owning a piece of. But he didn't see the skyline. He saw a diner. He saw a bowl of soup. He saw a girl who had nothing giving everything to a man who had lost everything. And he understood, with the kind of clarity that only comes at midnight in an empty room when the truth finally stops being patient, that the universe had not arranged this reunion as a coincidence. It had arranged it as a question. And the question was simple. She saved you when you had nothing. What are you going to do now that she has nothing and you have everything? What Julian learned in the days that followed wasn't just about Clara. It was about the architecture of silence itself. The invisible infrastructure that kept millions of children locked inside a world without sound, while the keys to their own doors sat in filing cabinets nobody told their parents existed. Marcus had become more than a chief of staff. He'd become a research partner. 9 years of managing calendars and conference calls and the professional machinery of a $3.8 billion fund. And now he was pulling medical databases and cross-referencing assistance programs at midnight because his boss had heard a woman cry outside a hospital and couldn't unhear it. 34 million children worldwide live with disabling hearing loss. 34 million. That's not a rounding error. That's not a footnote in a medical journal nobody reads. That's 34 million kids growing up in varying degrees of silence in a world that communicates almost entirely through sound. In the United States alone, approximately 2 to 3 out of every 1,000 children are born with detectable hearing loss. A cochlear implant, the surgery that could open the door between silence and sound, costs between $30,000 and $50,000 per ear. That's before rehabilitation. Before the speech therapy sessions that can run $150 an hour. Before the follow-up appointments and the processor upgrades and the batteries and the mapping sessions that fine-tune the device to each individual brain. And here was the part that made Julian's hands tighten around the edge of his desk. Medicaid coverage for cochlear implants varied by state. Some states covered it fully for children, others covered it partially. Others had age cutoffs that made no medical sense. In Massachusetts, the approval process involved a labyrinth of referrals, pre-authorizations, specialist evaluations, and appeals that could stretch 8 to 14 months. 14 months of paperwork, while a child's brain passed through the critical window for language development that neuroscience had established decades ago. The window doesn't wait for bureaucracy. It closes. Programs existed. Real ones. The Hearing Aid Project, through the Lions Clubs. Financial aid, through the Alexander Graham Bell Association. The Hearing the Call Foundation. State-funded early intervention grants. They were funded. They were operational. They were accepting applications. Clara qualified for at least 2 of them. She had always qualified. But nobody told her. Not the audiologist who diagnosed Lily. Not the pediatrician who referred her. Not the Medicaid office that denied her twice without mentioning alternative pathways. Not the hospital where she'd sat on a bench crying over an invoice that represented a door she'd been told was locked when it was never locked at all. The door wasn't locked. It was just invisible. And invisible doors only open for people who know where to look, which, by design, are never the people who need them most. Julian sat in the penthouse that night and thought about Clara standing in front of her neighbor, smiling, saying those 5 words. She hears me just fine. And he understood now what that sentence really was. It wasn't a statement about Lily's hearing. It was Clara's version of every lie every mother has ever told to hold the world together. The same structure, the same scaffolding. She hears me just fine. Mama already ate. Mama's fine. I'm not hungry. We're okay. 1,000 variations of the same architecture, built by women who decided that the truth was a weight their children should never have to carry. If this story is hitting you, subscribe for more like this. Now, let's continue. Julian went back to the hospital the following Thursday. Not for a gala, not in the Tom Ford. He wore a gray jacket, no watch visible, no car service. He took the T, got off at Longwood, walked through the main entrance like any other visitor, which, for the first time in 7 years, is exactly what he was. He found Clara in the lobby. She was sitting in a plastic chair near the audiology department, Lily on her lap, flipping through a picture book with illustrations of animals that Lily pointed to and signed. Elephant, giraffe, bird. Her small hands moved with the precision of a child who had built an entire language system from watching her mother's fingers at midnight. Julian sat down 2 chairs away, close enough to speak, far enough not to crowd. Excuse me, I think we met last week. Outside, on the bench, Clara looked up. The recognition was immediate, not warm, not cold, guarded. The careful, practiced assessment of a woman who had learned that people who showed up twice usually wanted something. Then Lily saw him. The girl's face didn't change the way a child's usually does around strangers. She studied him, tilted her head, then signed something to her mother. 2 quick movements. Clara almost smiled. Almost. She said he smells like the cold. She thinks you were outside a long time. Julian looked at Lily. 5 years old, hazel eyes that tracked the world with the patience of someone who'd learned to gather information through channels most people never use. She was reading him, not his words, his posture, his breathing, the micro-expressions around his eyes. She'd spent 5 years decoding a world that didn't speak her language, and she'd gotten better at it than most adults ever would. I was, Julian said. Then he looked at Clara. The scarf was still there, wrapped around her neck, gray-blue, frayed, 7 years of wear woven into every thread. You kept it. Clara's hand went to the scarf. Ausdaucht. The way you touch something that belongs to a part of your life. You haven't visited in a long time. You kept the scarf? She said. You kept the soup warm. That was enough. Silence. The kind that happens when 2 people are standing on either side of a sentence that neither of them knows how to finish. Julian didn't tell her about the fund, didn't mention the penthouse, didn't reach for a business card or a checkbook or any of the instruments that would have turned this moment into a transaction. He told her what he'd found. There's a program through the Lions Club's Hearing Aid Project. They partner with cochlear implant manufacturers to provide devices and surgical support for families who can't afford coverage. Lily qualifies. She's always qualified. There's also financial aid through the A.G. Bell Foundation. Covers surgical costs, rehabilitation, speech therapy. Your income, your situation, Lily's diagnosis. You check every box. Clara stared at him, her lips pressed together. The muscles in her jaw tightened the way they'd tightened on the bench outside, the way they tightened every time the world offered her something she hadn't asked for and couldn't afford to trust. How do you know all this? Because I looked. Because someone should have told you years ago and no one did. I don't need charity. The words came out the way they always did. Steady, rehearsed. A sentence she'd spoken so many times it had become structural, load-bearing, part of the wall that held everything else in place. Julian recognized the architecture. He'd seen it before. Inadiner, on a woman who had given away her only scarf to a stranger because she decided his cold was worse than hers. It's not charity, Clara. 7 years ago you gave a stranger everything you had and asked for nothing. I'm just finishing what you started. Clara didn't speak for a long time. Lily was signing something to herself, narrating the picture book in silence, her fingers tracing the shape of an elephant's trunk. The lobby hummed with the low machinery of a children's hospital, ventilation systems and elevator chimes, and the distant beep of monitors doing the quiet work of keeping small bodies alive. "You're the man from the diner," Clara said finally. "Not a question. I'm the man from the diner. I didn't think you made it." The sentence landed like a stone in still water. She'd spent 7 years not knowing if the man she'd given her scarf to had survived whatever he was drowning in that night. She'd carried that not knowing the way you carry a letter you mailed without a return address. You send it. You hope. You never find out. "I made it," Julian said. "Because of soup and a scarf and 5 words I still hear every time I think about quitting something." Julian didn't just connect Clara to the programs. He called Marcus that afternoon and outlined something larger. A patient navigator program at Boston Children's Hospital, funded through the Vance Capital Charitable Foundation. A team of 3 people, full-time, whose sole job was to sit with families like Clara's and map every available resource, every grant, every foundation, every state program, every federal benefit, every sliding scale payment option, every door that existed but had been rendered invisible by a system designed for people who already knew where to look. The Navigator program launched 8 weeks later. It was the first thing Julian had funded in 7 years that didn't feel like writing a check to dull the ache. It felt like building a door and putting a sign on it, and standing beside it so the people who needed it most could see it without needing a lawyer or a search engine or a chief of staff named Marcus to find it for them. Clara didn't take the manager's job. Julian offered it 3 weeks after their conversation in the hospital lobby. He'd opened a new restaurant concept in the Seaport district, part of a small chain he was quietly building, as a personal project separate from the fund. He needed a general manager, someone who understood food service from the inside, someone who'd worked the floor, the kitchen, the graveyard shift, someone who knew what it meant to carry plates for 8 hours on feet that hadn't seen new shoes in a year. Clara said no. Not the no of someone who didn't want it. The no of someone who wanted it too much to accept it on terms she hadn't earned. "I don't want a title I haven't earned. Give me the classroom first." Julian looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has just said the most inconvenient and most admirable thing he's heard in years. He nodded. Clara re-enrolled at Bunker Hill Community College. The Hospitality Management Program. Night classes. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. 6:30 to 9:15. The Second Start Scholarship covered tuition and books. It had existed the entire time she'd been scrubbing office floors at midnight. She just didn't know. Nobody told her. The pattern was always the same. The first obstacle was Lily. 3 nights a week, Clara needed someone to watch a 5-year-old who communicated in a language most people didn't speak. The subsidized daycare closed at 6. The extended voucher Denise had helped Tamara with in another story, in another version of this same math, didn't exist here. Clara had no family, no partner, no safety net. Rosa Delgado lived in apartment 4C, 1 floor above Clara's studio on Geneva Avenue, 68 years old. Retired from the Massachusetts School for the Deaf after 31 years as an ASL instructor. Her knees ached when it rained. Her apartment smelled like lavender oil, and the particular warmth of a home that had been lived in so long, it had absorbed the personality of the person inside it. Rosa had watched Clara come and go for 2 years, had seen her rushing down the hallway with Lily on one hip and a backpack on the other, had heard the apartment door close at 5 a.m. and open again at 10:30 p.m., had noticed, in the way that only a woman who'd spent 3 decades working with deaf children could notice, that the little girl on the 4th floor was signing with a fluency that most hearing parents never achieve. One Tuesday evening, As Clara was buckling Lily into the car seat and calculating whether she had enough gas to get to campus and back, Rosa appeared in the doorway of the building. "Give me the girl." Clara froze. "Miss Rosa, I can't ask you to. You didn't ask. I'm telling. Give me Lily. Go to class." Rosa signed the next part directly to Lily, her hands moving with the elegant precision of a woman who'd been speaking this language longer than Clara had been alive. "We're going to watch a movie and eat popcorn, and you're going to teach me which animals you learned today." Lily's face lit up, not the polite brightness of a child being handed off to a babysitter. The incandescent, full-body joy of a child who had just been spoken to in her own language by someone who wasn't her mother. From that night on, Rosa watched Lily every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. She never accepted payment. Clara tried once, a $20 bill left on Rosa's kitchen counter. Rosa found it, walked downstairs, slid it back under Clara's door, with a note written in both English and ASL gloss that said, "I spent 31 years teaching children to talk with their hands. This one teaches me." The relationship between Rosa and Lily became its own quiet story inside the larger one. The retired teacher and the 5-year-old, sitting on Rosa's sofa in the evenings, signing to each other about everything and nothing. Rosa taught Lily words she didn't know yet. Constellation, symphony, courage. Lily taught Rosa the sign she'd invented for her stuffed elephant, a combination of trunk and hug that didn't exist in any dictionary but made perfect sense. They communicated in complete silence, and they heard each other more clearly than most people who share a spoken language ever do. Clara, for her part, began doing something she hadn't done since before Lily was born. She started talking to other mothers. At the daycare pickup line, where she'd spent 2 years keeping her head down and her sentences short, she started sharing, not her story, information, the Lions Club's program, the A.G. Bell Foundation, the Navigator Service at Boston Children's, the sliding scale audiology clinics that existed 20 minutes away from neighborhoods where mothers were paying full price because nobody told them there was another option. She printed a 1-page sheet, typed it up on the library computer at 11 p.m. on a Sunday, listed every resource she'd learned about in the past month, handed copies to 3 mothers at daycare whose children had hearing loss or speech delays or chronic conditions that the system had decided were too expensive to treat and too complicated to navigate. The person who had been helped became the person who helped. The circle expanded, not because Clara sought credit, because she remembered what it felt like to sit on a bench with an invoice she couldn't pay, believing every door was locked, when the doors had been there all along. One Thursday after class, Rosa asked about Lily's surgery. Clara smiled, started to say the words she'd been saying for 5 years, the automatic response, the wall, the lie that held everything in place. "She hears me, just F." She stopped, mid-sentence. The words caught in her throat, like a key in a lock that no longer fit. For the first time, Clara Murphy did not finish that sentence, because for the first time, she dared to believe that Lily might actually hear her, not the way she'd been pretending, not through signs and guesses and the desperate telepathy of a mother who'd built a bridge between 2 worlds using nothing but her hands. Actually hear her, her voice, her words, the sound of her name spoken out loud by the person who loved her most. Clara stood in the hallway of the apartment building on Geneva Avenue, holding her textbook against her chest, and let the unfinished sentence hang in the air like a door left open on purpose. Rosa looked at her, nodded. The nod of a woman who had spent 31 years watching silence become sound, and who recognized the exact moment when a mother stopped pretending and started hoping. Month 4 broke her. Not all at once. The way things always break when you're poor and tired, and holding together a life that has too many moving parts and not enough margin. It breaks at 1 a.m. on a kitchen floor, when the apartment is dark and everyone is asleep. Except you, because sleep is a luxury that requires a mind at rest, and your mind hasn't rested since a doctor told you, your daughter would never hear your voice. Lily's surgery had been scheduled for March 12th. 2 weeks before the date, Lily spiked a fever. 103.2. Double ear infection. The surgeon postponed. Medical protocol. No surgery until the infection cleared completely, and the child had been fever-free for at least 10 days. 10 days that felt like 10 months to a mother who'd been counting down since the day the approval came through. The same week, the restaurant in Brookline cut Clara's Thursday and Friday morning shifts. New management. Restructuring. The polite corporate language for, we need fewer people, and you're the easiest to let go because you never complain. 2 lost shifts. $320 gone from a paycheck that was already a math problem with no solution. $320 was rent's margin of error. $320 was the space between on time and late notice. $320 was groceries for almost 2 weeks. And the hospitality management final exam was on Friday, chapters 9 through 16. Menu engineering, cost control, labor scheduling, revenue management. The kind of material that required focus, and focus required a mind that wasn't calculating how to cover rent with 2 missing shifts, and a sick child, and a surgery postponement, that felt like the universe pulling back a hand it had just extended. Clara sat on the floor of the apartment at 1 a.m., her back against the radiator, the textbook open across her knees, the pages blurred because her eyes had been open for 21 hours, and the words had stopped meaning anything 3 hours ago. Lily was asleep on the bed, the fever broken at 10, but the exhaustion still carved into her small face like a map of everything her body had been fighting. The apartment smelled like children's ibuprofen, and the particular silence that fills a room when a mother is the only person awake and the weight of the world is sitting on her shoulders like a passenger that never pays fare. She picked up her phone, scrolled to a name she'd added 5 weeks ago, hesitated, pressed call. Julian answered on the second ring. 8 inches the morning, and his voice was clear. The voice of a man sitting in a penthouse surrounded by screens and spreadsheets, and the particular insomnia of someone who'd replaced sleep with productivity so long ago he'd forgotten which one he was avoiding. I can't do this. Clara's voice was flat. Not crying. Beyond crying. The sound a person makes when every tear has been spent and what remains is just the architecture of exhaustion holding up a sentence. I thought I could. I thought if I just tried hard enough, worked long enough, stayed up late enough, I could be a mother and a student and a worker and everything Lily needs all at the same time. But something has to break, and I'm afraid it's going to be me. Julian was quiet. The kind of quiet that fills a phone line the way pressure fills a room before the walls give. He could hear Lily breathing in the background, the soft rhythm of a child sleeping through a crisis she would never know happened. You told me something once, Julian said. His voice was low, careful, the voice of a man choosing every word the way a surgeon chooses where to cut. In a diner. At 2 a.m., I was sitting in a booth with nothing. No money, no plan, no reason to believe tomorrow was worth showing up for. And you put a bowl of soup in front of me, and you said 5 words. Silence. You said, "You're not done yet," and I didn't believe you. I thought you were just a kind girl saying kind things to a stranger who was too far gone to hear them. But you were right. You were right. And those 5 words kept me alive long enough to become someone who could sit here at 1 a.m. and tell you the same thing. He paused, then said it. You're not done yet, Clara. The words traveled through the phone line across the city, from a penthouse on Beacon Hill to a studio apartment on Geneva Avenue, from a man who had everything to a woman who was holding everything together with her bare hands, and they landed the way they had landed 7 years ago, in a diner on Massachusetts Avenue, not as advice, not as encouragement, as a fact spoken by someone who had earned the right to say it because they'd lived inside the opposite and survived. Clara didn't respond. She set the phone on the floor beside her, pressed both palms flat against the textbook. Menu engineering, cost control, labor scheduling, revenue management, the architecture of running a restaurant, which was really just the architecture of making sure people were fed, which was really just the architecture of care organized into a system, which was what Clara had been doing her entire life without a textbook or a certificate or a title. She studied until 4:30 inches the morning, 3.5 hours of silence, broken only by the turning of pages and the click of the radiator and the soft breathing of a child who would never know that her mother almost quit at 1:08 a.m. on a Thursday in the dark, and kept going because a man she'd once given a scarf to gave her back the only thing she'd ever given him, 5 words. And the knowledge that they still worked. She took the final on Friday, scored a B+. The surgery happened on a Tuesday in April, 7:15 a.m., Boston Children's Hospital. Operating Room 4, Dr. Sarah Chen, pediatric otolaryngologist, 15 years of experience, hands that had opened the door between silence and sound for over 200 children. Clara sat in the waiting room for 3 hours and 42 minutes. She didn't read. She didn't scroll her phone. She sat in a plastic chair with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the clock above the nurse's station, watching the second hand make its slow, indifferent orbit around the dial, and thought about every sound Lily had never heard. Rain on a window, a dog barking, the ice cream truck that came down Geneva Avenue every summer, playing a song that every child on the block ran toward except Lily, who watched from the window and signed the word music even though she'd never experienced it. Her name, her own name, Lily, spoken out loud by the person who chose it. The surgery was successful. 4 weeks of recovery. Then the activation appointment. The day the external processor would be turned on for the first time, and Lily Murphy, 5 years old, would hear sound. The audiologist's office was small, white walls, a desk with a computer, 2 chairs, a window that looked out onto a courtyard where a single tree was just beginning to show green. Clara sat in one chair with Lily on her lap. The audiologist, a woman named Dr. Park, sat across from them with a laptop connected to the processor behind Lily's ear. The room was quiet. Everyone was quiet. Rosa sat in the hallway outside, her hands folded, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer, or might have been the ASL sign for listen, which is the same gesture, palm cupped behind the ear, leaning forward, waiting. Dr. Park looked at Clara. Ready? Clara nodded. Her throat was too tight to speak. Dr. Park pressed a key on the laptop. The processor activated. A small green light blinked on, and the room, which had been silent, was suddenly full of sound. The hum of the air conditioning, the buzz of the fluorescent light, the click of the laptop keyboard, the rustle of Clara's jacket as she breathed. Sounds that meant nothing to everyone else in the room and meant everything to the girl sitting on her mother's lap. Lily's eyes went wide, not scared, startled. The particular startlement of encountering something you've never experienced before and realizing it's been here the whole time, surrounding you, filling every room you've ever been in, and you just couldn't reach it. Clara leaned close, her voice shaking, small, the quietest she'd ever spoken because she was terrified that the first sound her daughter ever heard from her mouth would be too loud, too much, too overwhelming for a brain that was processing vibration for the very first time. "Hi, baby. Mama's here." Lily turned her head, not toward the sound exactly, toward the source, toward the face that had always been there, the lips she'd spent 5 years reading, the hands she'd spent 5 years watching. But now, there was something else. Something coming from that face that she'd never detected before. A vibration, a wave, a warmth that traveled through the air and landed somewhere inside her head and became a word. Her eyes locked onto Clara's mouth, her lips parted. And then, Lily Murphy smiled. The kind of smile that starts in the eyes and moves down through the entire body like a current, like electricity, like the moment a circuit completes and the light comes on in a room that's been dark for 5 years. Clara broke. Not the controlled braking she'd practiced in parking lots and hospital benches and apartment floors at 1 a.m. The real kind. The kind that comes from the chest and the throat and the place behind the sternum, where a mother stores every prayer she's ever whispered into the dark hoping someone was listening. Julian stood outside the audiologist's office. He'd driven from the penthouse at 6 a.m., told Marcus to clear the morning. He didn't go in. He stood in the hallway beside Rosa, his back against the wall, and watched through the glass panel in the door. He heard Clara's voice, small and fractured, and carrying the full weight of 5 years of silence, 5 years of signing, 5 years of pretending. And then he heard the words. Not the words Clara said to Lily. The words Clara whispered to herself, so quietly that only someone standing right outside the door with their ear tuned to the exact frequency of a mother's breaking point would have caught them. She hears me. She really hears me. Julian closed his eyes, leaned his head back against the wall, felt the sentence land in his chest the way her scarf had landed on his shoulders 7 years ago. Warm, unexpected. Enough. She hears me just fine. The sentence Clara had said 1,000 times to neighbors and doctors and daycare workers and herself. The wall, the lie, the structure that held everything in place. She hears me. She really hears me. The same words, rearranged. The lie turned into truth. The wall turned into a window. The door that had been invisible opened. 2 months later, Clara graduated from the hospitality management program at Bunker Hill Community College. She accepted the general manager position at Julian's restaurant in the Seaport District. Not because it was offered, because she'd earned it. Because the certificate on her wall, and the 3 semesters of work, and the B+ on the final exam that she'd studied for on a kitchen floor at 1 a.m. with a sick daughter, and no margin for error, had made it hers. On her first day, she left something on Julian's desk, a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a scarf, hand-knitted, gray-blue yarn. Uneven stitches, tighter in some rows, looser in others. New, not frayed, not worn. The fingerprint of someone who'd learned to knit from a YouTube video and never stopped practicing. A note was tucked inside. Notebook paper, Clara's handwriting, small and neat. For the next person who walks into a diner at 2 a.m. and looks like they've forgotten someone's waiting for them. Julian held the scarf in both hands. The new yarn smelled like nothing. No diner grease, no laundry detergent, no 7 years of being worn through winters and washed by a woman who kept it, because it was the only proof she had that kindness still traveled in both directions. It smelled like a beginning. They were married on a Saturday in September at Cape Cod. Not a billionaire's wedding, not a ballroom, not 500 guests and a string quartet and champagne that cost more than Clara used to earn in a month. A beach. Late afternoon. The kind of light that turns everything gold and makes the ocean look like it's been waiting all day for this exact moment. 30 people. Rosa, in the second row, signing the vows to Lily in real time. Her hands moving with the elegance of a woman translating love into a language that doesn't need sound to be heard. Lily stood at the front in a white dress, barefoot in the sand, holding a basket of flower petals she'd been scattering with the serious concentration of a child performing the most important job in the world. And when the waves came in, loud and white and crashing against the shore the way they'd been crashing for 1,000,000 years before anyone was there to hear them, Lily Murphy looked up at her mother with wide hazel eyes and said, out loud, in a voice that was still learning the shape of words but had already mastered the shape of wonder, "Mama, the ocean is loud." Clara laughed. Julian laughed. Rosa covered her mouth with both hands. And for a moment, standing on a beach at the edge of an ocean that a little girl was hearing for the first time, nobody in that small circle of 30 people needed to be told that the world, for all its broken systems and invisible doors and invoices that read like verdicts, was still capable of getting it right. This story is fictional, but cochlear implants are real. The gap between diagnosis and access is real. Over 34 million children worldwide live with hearing loss that needs intervention. In the United States, the cost of a cochlear implant ranges from $30,000 to $50,000 per ear, and insurance coverage remains inconsistent across states. Programs like the Lions Club's Hearing Aid Project, the Alexander Graham Bell Association Financial Aid Program, and state early intervention services exist. They are funded, they are operational, They go underused every year because the families who need them most don't know they exist. And somewhere tonight, a mother is sitting across from her child, smiling, saying everything's fine, saying we're okay, saying she hears me just fine, while behind the smile, she's calculating which bill she can skip, which meal she can miss, which piece of herself she can subtract so the math works out and her child never has to know what's missing. If you know a parent like that, someone who gives everything and keeps nothing, someone who says I'm fine in a voice that means I'm drowning, don't look away. Don't walk past. See them. That's where everything starts. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if this story meant something to you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. See you in the next one.